Hey everybody, Miss Lynch here. This is the first part of chapter 21's lecture. Okay, so hopefully you have all your stuff ready to go by this point, your book, notebook, notes, anything you need. And yes, that should be it. And sorry, I was starting to kind of go down a rabbit hole of a thought. Okay, we are ready to go. And the last thing we were talking about in chapter 20 was the beginning of the Great Depression. We ended, Black Tuesday happens 1929, and we left off talking about Herbert Hoover, okay? And Hoover's response to things, which was considered inadequate by the American public, okay? We had talked about rising unemployment rates, a homelessness crisis, and the rise of shanty towns known as Hoovervilles. Okay, so where we left off was 1932, and that's where we pick up today. So, all right, chapter 21, the New Deal, 1932, like I said, that's where we're starting, and this will take us to the beginning of World War II, all right? Okie dokie, so looking at our first slide, and I do not have my textbook in front of me today, so hopefully there's nothing pertinent to look at, we'll see. Okay, anywho, the New Deal. Alrighty, so let's talk about FDR. Like I said, he comes into office in 1932. He had previously served as Undersecretary of the Navy and had run for vice president. He projected a strong public image despite the fact that he was confined to a wheelchair. He had had polio in 1921, and yeah, this was widely known amongst the media, but it was hidden from public view because the nation was in the middle of this crisis, and they were worried that seeing the president in a wheelchair would convey, this perception of weakness, so to speak, okay? Anytime FDR had to give a speech, he was, before any cameras were rolling, any pictures were taken, he would get up to the podium, and there would be like braces in place, and they would basically lock his feet into this position, and then he would stand up, and then they would capture any images of him. So that's kind of what the public saw. Also, we'll get to this here in a little bit, but he will do this nationwide campaign, and the whole thing is him in a vehicle. So he would stop and talk to people, from a convertible, but he never was seen getting in and out of the car. So this whole perception of FDR, being the sound force for the United States was something that was really held in regards by the media, okay? Alrighty. Okay, so like I said, a few knew about this because the media helped to conceal it for years. Pretty much during that generation, it was considered to be a bit more of a secret, okay? Anywho. Okie dokie, still talking about FDR. In accepting the Democratic nomination, he promised that he would bring what he called his New Deal to the American public, although he kept it pretty vague during campaign, which would be for the best because then that gives you room to kind of work with. But in 1932, he wins the campaign on this idea of him bringing in this New Deal, him helping the American public get out of this depression that they're in, okay? Okay. He saw his New Deal as an alternative to socialism on the left. Remember, we're coming out of the progressive era, our workers' movement, the Red Scare, and that fear of communism and Russians. All of that is considered to be, on the left, socialism, all right? Also coming out of World War I, we had discussed Germany being in this state of ruin and having to pay reparations, defaulting on being able to pay back Allied powers, and this is whenever Hitler and the Nazi Party starts to really take hold of Germany, okay? So socialism is considered to be on the left side, Nazism is on the right. So FDR coming into this, he is saying that he is taking the middle ground, okay? To the inaction of upholders. Yeah, and then also he criticized the institution of capitalism, saying that all of this greed and want for power is what led to the collapse and the Great Depression, okay? And like I said, he ran on this platform of economic recovery, which is what his New Deal was all about. Okay, for his council, this was known as his Brains Trust. So these are members of his administration that held key positions and were able to help him come up with the policies that we'll get to here in a minute. But so he starts organizing and getting people in that he think can help him develop a solid plan of the New Deal. Okay, intellectuals and social workers. Yeah, this was his Brains Trust. And this first portion of this, which is what so there are two parts, the first New Deal, second New Deal. So the first New Deal, this will go from 1933 to 1936. And yeah, so the remainder of this video, so part one, will be through the first deal, or the first New Deal, and then the second half will be the second New Deal, okay? Okie dokie. First things first, they had to address the financial issues within the United States, so the banking crisis, okay? All right, so I'm looking at the slide called The Banking Crisis. All right, FDR confronted a banking system that was on the verge of collapse. Some would say that, had collapsed. He takes office, like we said, 1932. His first day on the job is in March of 1933. And by that time, the majority of states had completely suspended banking. So like I said, you could consider it collapsed at that point because most states are just completely halting any operations. People could not access their money. And this is causing major distress amongst the American population, understandably so. So first thing he does, like I said, he comes into office, or first day on the job is March 4th. And within this first week, he declares a bank holiday. So all banks close down so they can kind of regroup. So this halts all banking operations. And he then called Congress into a special session to address this, okay? Like I said, this is within the first week. So the special session is on the 9th. So he'd been in office for 5 days, okay? And they passed what is known as the Emergency Banking Act to help threaten banks, that should say. Sorry, there's a typo in the PowerPoint if you're looking at that. It says backs, should say banks. Okay. So they passed the Emergency Banking Act, and then they also create the FDIC, which I have talked about just briefly, and we should know about it because if you have a bank account, your bank is supported by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So whenever we were talking about Black Tuesday, all of that money that disappeared, this is why the FDIC is then developed, so that will never happen again. Money is accounted for. Yeah, so these are the first two measures that are passed under FDR regarding the banking crisis. Okay, and then the second stage of what he does, and this will become bigger in the second New Deal, but there's a huge focus on government jobs. Going back to the recession of 2009 and on, there was discussive, why don't we create jobs, create government jobs? Let's look at what FDR did. What did the New Deal do? And then even this past year, 2020, that has been a discussion also in regards to unemployment. Well, can't we create jobs? So as I'm going through all of these implements that were done under FDR, I want you to think about if something like that could have been done more recently, as a way to address certain issues that are happening currently. Anyway, just something to think about, okay? But so government jobs. The 100 days, which is FDR's first 100 days, and sets up that precedent of looking at every president after him and what have they done within the first, 3 months of their presidency. So this is where that terminology 100 days comes from. Okay, so we talked about our banking measures, and then there's also the Federal Emergency Relief Administration that works with local agencies to help people affected by the Depression, in local communities. There's also the Conservation Corps that is, you can get online and look at projects that were built during this time, built bridges, armories, public buildings, public works. So yeah, this is kind of the precedent for FDR's administration, okay? But so first we have the Civilian Conservation Corps. They begin by working in forests. So forest preservation, managing things like flood control, so building dams, okay? Our national park system, okay? Wildlife preserves. So all of those agencies are creating jobs to help cushion the unemployment rate, okay? And so basically during the 30s going up until World War II, 3 million people would pass through this program, okay? So in the second phase, we'll get to the WPA, but this is the PWA, okay, so the Public Works Administration. So like I said, our bridges, so roads, it's part of that. Schools, hospitals, and then, dams, like I said before. But so all of these public works and building and creating infrastructure and creating jobs for people, like I said, that becomes the core of FDR's administration. Okay. And, we talked about farmers. In about every chapter, we talk about our rural populations. And, during the 1920s, most of our rural population remained poor. They did not partake in, the prosperity of that time. And whenever the Depression hits, these people who were already vulnerable are really hit in, equally as hard ways compared to other populations. But our rural population is devastated during this time. And we'll get into Oklahoma here in just a sec. But so the Agricultural Adjustment Act is passed, and this authorized the federal government to try to raise farm prices by setting quotas and by paying farmers not to plant more, okay? And they destroy crops, they slaughter animals. With the animal slaughter, this happens in pretty great numbers in the Panhandle during the Dust Bowl, okay? But, all right, so in 1933, 6 million pigs were slaughtered under this policy. And rather than, maybe trying to utilize that meat to feed our unemployed and starving populations, they would bury the animals. So there is, a time of widespread hunger, but the meat was not used, okay? Anywho, if we had been in class during this lecture, I would pause and we would watch this episode of Ken Burns' The Dust Bowl, because that hits, during this time. But that policy of animal slaughter, you can see that in the cattle industry in northwestern Oklahoma throughout the 1930s, okay? So millions of animals slaughtered during this time. Anyway, but so this is considered successful because it significantly raised farm prices and helped our large farmers, although it generally hurt small farmers and small farms and our tenant farmers. So our poor farmers, like I said, who were already vulnerable to begin with, are just, again, hit with a lot of devastation. And then this is whenever the Dust Bowl hits, our part of the world, okay? So there's a severe drought. This is what leads to the Dust Bowl. And we had talked about farmers during the 20s already going west to California, which is why it's kind of known as this pattern. And whenever the Dust Bowl hits, the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma Panhandle, Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado, although the epicenter of it, and if you watch that Ken Burns episode, if you can find it, it goes through this map of the whole decade and it's showing where the epicenter of the storm is. So it's just kind of like morphing. But the epicenter of the entire Dust Bowl is Boise City, Oklahoma, in Cimarron County. Anyway. What was I saying though? But so that is why whenever all of that is happening, anybody who leaves this whole region, so all of those states that I named that are being affected by the Dust Bowl, anybody that leaves and goes to California or the West Coast or just anywhere, just leaves, is considered to be an Okie. So that's where that term comes about. But yeah, so that's just a generalized term. So any Depression era migrant farmer becomes known as an Okie. Okay. So housing, let us look at this. Okay, so the Depression devastated the housing market or industry, understandably so. People don't have jobs, so they, can't pay their rent or their mortgages. People aren't buying houses. Okay, so all of this makes sense. Again, looking at the recession in 2009, during that time, there was a lot of parallels about the housing market of the Depression compared to 2009. So this is what we're looking at. Okay, the Federal Housing Administration is created, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and these are instituted as ways to help people, to stimulate the housing market, help people pay for their homes, okay? And then there are also two important measures of Roosevelt's first 2 years. So the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition, okay? And then, which we'll get into this more down the line, but the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is created. And then kind of lastly on this slide is the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates the stock market, all right? So, important. Oh, alrighty. Last thing I'm gonna talk about for this little lecture is the grassroots revolt. Talking about our workers. Interesting. Okay. So organized labor, they experienced an upsurge in the mid-1930s. This makes sense. There are a lot of disgruntled workers and unemployed people organizing, okay? So that there's a resurgence that hadn't really been seen, since before World War I. Unlike in the past, the federal government now seemed to be on the side of labor. Okay, so there's that shift, with, all of these corporations and groups that are being formed, all of these government jobs. Okay, so that makes, that supports this idea that the government was siding with labor. Okay, workers' demands of the 30s went beyond better wages. All their goals required union recognition, So there is an increase in unionization. And let's see, Roosevelt's election as president did much to rekindle, our labor movement. But unfortunately, this was, sparked out of desperation. So in 1934, there are over 2,000 strikes that are organized throughout the United States. So there is still a lot of there are a lot of issues that are being addressed by workers. So our entire progressive era, all of that stuff, that movement didn't go away because everything was resolved. There were 2 world wars that happened, there's a world war that happened. And then we'll have this resurgence, which will then kind of be squashed again by another world war. So, anywho, but this, like I said, these first couple of years are known as the first New Deal. And so that is kind of where our chapter breaks. And I'm going to pick up with the second New Deal, okay? All right. If you guys have any questions about anything, feel free to give me a shout, shoot me an email, and I will see you later. Okay, bye.